Okay, great. Great. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started here. So be just a moment. So as we move forward today, I want to make sure that you have your chat box open because we will be using chat. So be sure to do that. I really thank Elizabeth. We met each other through Network for Good, and I really appreciate her reaching out to me to talk about an issue that does face a lot of us, whether or not we live in a rural area or we are looking at expanding into a rural area. So I want to just thank Elizabeth for inviting me. I do live in Montana, and I'm a fourth generation Montanan. I bleed Montana. So where I live is definitely rural, but I am working with organizations across the United States through Network for Good and have seen a difference between rural versus urban areas. So we're going to be really digging into that. Now, I'm so appreciative of being a part of this bi-monthly webinar series. As you can see, it's a general topic overview. It is not going really, really deep, but we're going to answer 4 questions. And as we answer those 4 questions, you'll be able to take elements of those and dig in deeper. So it's just a very overview of rural fundraising. Did you come today with any questions? And if you did, please go ahead and put them in the chat room right now. So we're going to leave just a few moments right now. If you could type in chat what questions that you have. If you prefer not to use chat, go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and speak up. So let's just take a few moments and see what your questions are today. Or why you're here.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Herbert.
Okay, thank you. I live in a town of 6,000 people. We have been in this community for 26 years, our organization. We do have an office, a program office for the last 6 years in Albuquerque, which has 900,000 people there. But my question about rural communities is just burning out our donors and sponsors. We have about 60 to 100 donors that we can rely on. One of them is literally the executive director's mother-in-law.
Right.
And I know a lot of these people for sure, and I don't want to. I want to ask them because they give, and I want to thank them because they deserve it. But I guess my question is, how do I increase our donor base in such a small town? And similarly, when it comes to sponsorships for our annual event, I end up calling the same 14 people every year and ask them for $1,000. About 8 of them give. Some do, some don't. Some are very reliable. So the same question is, how do I not burn them out, and how do I expand that donor base in such a small town?
Right, exactly. Those are 2 great questions. We are going to be talking about how do you find resources outside your area. So we're going to go ahead and address that in 2 different ways. Because that is the challenge. When you're in a rural area, there is a limited number of people. So definitely. Any other questions or why you came today?
Hello, I'm Destiny.
Hi.
Hi. I work in an organization that we have a main office in a larger urban city, but we serve 16 rural counties, surrounding rural counties. And so our challenge is not in burning out our donors, but in engaging those donors, potential donors in those counties where we're not necessarily present, although we do provide a service to them. So it's hard to kind of crack into that base of them realizing that they need us, and then also convincing them to support someone who's not always present.
Right, exactly. When you have that program, but you don't necessarily have the fundraising staff there too, right? Definitely. We will talk a little bit about that. And there is a strategy in how you're structured. And so I'll mention it and think more about that. We're not going to go very deep into that, but it's something to think about. So thank you, Destiny. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is how we define rural. What is rural to me is not necessarily rural to you. So if somebody is living in LA, Los Angeles, they may see Stockton, California as a very rural area. But in reality, it is a small city. Whereas an hour outside of Stockton, they would see Stockton as the big city, and it's a huge city for them. So we do have to think about what is rural and how do we define it. So in the chat room, I have put a video for everyone to go ahead and watch really quickly. It's like 3 minutes, super quick. But what I'd like you to do is go ahead and mute yourself, click on the video, watch the video, and then when you're done, put in chat that you've watched the video. So go ahead and click on it. And watch it, and then let me know when you're done. Okay, folks are just starting to get done watching the video. So any quick feedback other than I'm planning on moving to Montana? That's not the goal of this video. So any quick feedback when you're thinking about what is rural, when you're watching that video, how would you define rural?
Wide open spaces, small towns.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody
Exactly.
knows one another.
Mm-hmm.
For good or bad.
Right, exactly. Everyone knows each other. Yes, it is very cultural when we're talking about rural. You have that idea community where everybody knows each other and gets into each other's business oftentimes for good or for bad. It becomes very difficult to change because people see you as one way and then changing is difficult. So that really has, that affects when we're coming into an area, if we're a nonprofit looking at expanding, if there had been a bad experience with that nonprofit previously, there is that idea of we have changed as a nonprofit, that's hard to communicate because they do have those long memories. So it's difficult to show that change. So yes, being rural is very cultural. There is actually also a definition of rural. And so when we're looking at rural areas as defined by the census, it is 50,000 people or less. Less than 25% of people commute to an urbanized area. And you have the wide open spaces, you have the less developed land. So that's what is defined as rural. Now, one thing that I do want to note here, and this does apply to the conversation that we were just having of how do we reach out outside of our areas, is with the pandemic, there are more urban workers who are working remotely in rural areas. And there has been a huge migration into rural areas by these urban workers, which means that they are bringing their salaries from an urban area into rural areas. And that provides a new area of people to reach out to, but it also gives us a connection to an urban area for funding. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, it has its own challenges, as everybody in rural areas can say who have attracted those urban workers. It means that our housing prices have just skyrocketed. And so that has its own unique challenges. So as we move forward, that's the definition that we're going to use. We're going to use the definition of the culture, the people, the working, and the area, the land. So have you tried fundraising, but you don't know where to start? So one thing that you have to do when you're trying to do fundraising in a small town is to define the culture. Define the culture of those communities. Every community in a rural area has a different culture. So let me ask you this question. By a show of hands, thumbs up, or you can put this in chat. Have you ever, or would you ever, attend a high school basketball game if you don't know any of the players or any of the parents? Would you take time out of your busy schedule and attend a high school basketball game where you don't know the parents or the kids who are playing? A lot of no's, right? But in very small towns, oftentimes that does happen, where the town is so engaged with each other that the whole town shows up for the basketball games, the football games, the school orchestra concerts, partly because there's very little things to do in the community, and that's the social events, but also you have in a lot of communities a very engaged culture. So growing up in my community in Frenchtown, Montana, the whole community would show up for basketball games. Our stadium or our seating was huge in this town of 3,000 people, where almost everybody showed up for every football game, even if no one knew the parents or the kids. So that becomes something to think about, is how engaged is the community that you're in? So you can be in a very engaged small town where you're trying to fundraise, or you can be in a very disengaged. So in disengaged communities, that's where nobody shows up for those community events. There isn't a culture of engagement, and it becomes very difficult to move into those towns and to explain that the services that you're offering, like you mentioned, Destiny, is actually helping the community because they're so disengaged from each other. So let me give you an example of this in where I live. So the valley that I live, so this is just a valley. The valley that I live is the size of Connecticut. And there is 100,000 people in that whole valley. In one community in this valley, where I live, Big Fork, you have a lot of engagement, and the community comes together and volunteers to get things done. A community foundation provides all of the town maintenance in the community. So that's one community, very engaged. Another community in the same valley does not have that engagement at all. For 4th of July, just to give you an idea of that lack of engagement, they literally shoot fireworks at each other across a major roadway. Sort of the fun thing to do on 4th of July, that they're potentially harming each other. They're so disengaged. They don't show up for any of the kids' events, the high school events. They don't show up at any of those. And it's a very disengaged culture. So it's been very difficult for nonprofits that are trying to work in that community to get the community support because it's already a disengaged community. So be aware of that. How engaged is the community where you're working? We'll talk about some strategies if you're working in a disengaged community. But if you feel like you're just hitting your head up against the wall, it might be this too. So just keep that in mind. The next question we want to address is, how do you feel that fundraising experts aren't talking to you or are recommending strategies for urban areas? So we're going to break that apart. So the first way that we're going to break that apart is, how do you feel fundraising experts aren't talking to you? And the first element to this is the outsider effect. So I lived in Maine for a while, and I loved living in Maine. I met people who were 16th generation Maynards, which blew my mind, of course. And so me coming into Maine, I was always going to be the outsider. I talked to people who had lived there for 3 or 4 generations. They were still the outsiders. And so when we're thinking about moving into an area, expanding into an area with services, there's that effect of being the outsider. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. In small towns and rural areas, they oftentimes experience a blow-in, blow-out effect, meaning that somebody comes in, has these great ideas, discovers that they really can't live in a rural area because of the culture, the connections that they feel to the community, it wasn't what they thought it was, etc. So they come in, have all of these changes, they're all very excited to be involved in the community, and then they leave. And what happens for those small communities is they have ramped up to be able to work with this person. They get really excited, and then there's no follow through. And that can really damage those relationships. We also have an effect of when a person from the outside comes in, they say they love the community, but I want to change it. And so for those of us who are living in that small community, who have spent years and years, generations, making that community into what it is, to be told that, oh, it's not good enough, that's just offensive, right? And so there is that feeling oftentimes. So if you're expanding into a rural area, one of the things to think about is, how do we not be an outsider? One of the communities in Montana, it's a very small 20,000 people community. They were thinking about just expanding into their surrounding areas. So it's a rural town expanding into the surrounding areas. They just assumed, like, oh, we know what we're doing. We provide great services. We have fantastic donors. It should be easy for us too. So they went to expand into these rural areas that are surrounding them, the more rural areas, I should say, because they're already a rural town, and they couldn't get traction. They didn't have the right people involved, and they didn't spend time listening to those folks. So it's really important as you're thinking about expanding into those rural areas, or if you're already in those rural areas, is to discover who the right people are. In my community, there is one woman in the community who knows everything that's going on in the community. And if she is negative towards something, boy, I guarantee that that initiative is not going to go forward. So it's really important that that as a organization thinking of expanding, that they think about talking to this person. Now, you might assume that that person that I'm mentioning is, let's say, a bank president or a owner of a business. It's not. It's the grocery clerk at the one grocery store. Now, if I were coming into that community, I would probably never know that, right? I would not know that the key person in the community is that one woman, but it is. And so that's where, when we are looking at rural fundraising, we have to think about who is the right people. We have to ask the question, who in the community knows everything that's going on? Who in the community really is influential, not based on status? And identifying that person. So it's really important that as you are moving into a rural community, or if you're already in a rural community, to spend more time listening. Any thoughts on this one? Have you experienced that in terms of being the outsider? So you can unmute yourself. Herbert.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely have experienced being the outsider myself. I've been here for 17 years, but a lot of people act as if I just got here, and that's okay, because I think as long as I live here, the community will be a big mystery to me in lots of ways. I don't know if it's totally unique to Taos, but it does feel like a very divided community between haves and have-nots. A lot of that seems to be based on race. I see a whole lot of resentment from the Hispanics towards they call them, oh boy, what do they call them? Newcomers.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is deserved. A lot of it isn't. There's also a Native American community who, and my experience, they're just sort of sitting on the sidelines and saying, whatever with you people.
Right.
You guys can do your own thing. We're here in our community. We're going to take care of our own. I see that a lot, but there is definitely a divide between haves and have-nots, and newcomers and longtime residents, and it's kind of bothersome to me on a personal level, but that is very definitely a thing here. And if I may, in listening to you talk, I started taking notes of kind of breakdown culture as I see it in the community here, and how to kind of segment that. And if I think kind of where we're heading is, for me, it's how do I reach out to these people with a slightly different message that's frankly going to get them to give us money, right?
Right.
And so, the culture by race of white, Hispanic, Native, by their activity. Are they outdoors people? Where do they work? Their values, like, are they environmentalists or activists? The specific communities that they live in, the little hamlets. And then I said, by their tenure, like, are they newcomers or are they kind of multi-generational? And so can anticipate my question based on that is, how can I segment that and communicate with them differently? So that's my reaction to your.
Yeah, exactly. And so then it becomes really important is once you identify those segments, is who's the right person, who's the influential person in each of those segments, that you start really spending time building the relationship, listening. Destiny, you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm from a rural, can't even call it a town. I'm from the middle of nowhere. The neighboring town of 75 people's post office was our post office because we didn't have enough, So I mean,
Right.
I get that. That's where I grew up, and so for me, it wasn't that no, we didn't always know everybody. We support everything. It was that everybody knew everybody, and so it was a very tight knit group of, like you said, the outsider effect of they're not from here, they don't know us, they don't know how we do things, and so they don't belong, or who are they to tell us how, so, and that's kind of what we deal with the areas that we serve, is that we don't live there. We're coming in trying to tell them that we need money for this, and we're going to do this, and you need to support us. And what we do is we provide services to child victims of abuse and neglect. And so it's a twofold, where it's not only are we outsiders, but that stuff doesn't happen there. That doesn't happen to our kids. We don't have to worry about that. We don't need you. And so that's really the battle that we fight, is not only that we're not in the community, we're not members of that community, but then whatever it is that we're trying to get funds for is not their problem.
Right. And because of the confidentiality, you can't give information to say, actually, it's happening there. Especially since it's such a small area, that if you provide any type of information, you're going to out the person it is, because everybody knows each other. And so they're like, oh, that's so-and-so, right? And you can't do that.
Even if you don't give a name, if you just give a general description, they're going to figure it out.
Right, exactly, immediately. Yeah, so that does become a challenge. And one of the benefits that you have from your childhood is that you can meet them at that same level, saying, oh, I understand what it's like to be in an area, and the outsiders tell us what to do.
Yes.
And so that is something that you can lead with and say, oh, I get this. Like, I know. So tell me, like, how do we want to make sure that this doesn't happen versus it is happening? How do we make sure it doesn't happen? So that becomes a more important way to lead those conversations. So we're going to go back to that is that funding issue. How do you then encourage that funding? So we'll go back to that conversation. So let's go ahead and move on to what are some strategies that are being recommended that are for large urban areas that just aren't working in rural areas. So the first piece is the technology. A lot of rural areas have huge challenges getting basic technology. There is a digital divide. So for example, for me, I live 5-10 miles, depending where we're at, 10 miles from the area of Big Fork that receives 100 megabytes of service for internet. I couldn't get internet for 5 years. And I don't live in that rural of an area. So what we see is oftentimes these rural areas don't have the technology to be able to do what is being recommended. So for example, during the pandemic, nationally, fundraising experts were saying, go virtual, do a virtual event. Well, the virtual event works in the most immediate area, the biggest town in the area. But as soon as you go outside the town, it doesn't work. There's not enough technology. There's not enough bandwidth. There's not enough connectivity. So if you're a rural person who cannot get internet, they're not going to invest in the technologies to be able to get internet in the future, right? They're not going to buy a device and then drive into town to be able to participate in that virtual event. So there has to be strategies to make sure that you address the technology. Next, there is infrastructure issues. So you have oftentimes the urbanized area, the big city, whether or not the big city is 75 people, or if the big city is 10,000 or 20,000, oftentimes the surrounding area doesn't have the same level of infrastructure. So to give you an example of this, I moved back to Montana. I was living in Maine. I moved back to Montana, and I encouraged the nonprofit that I was serving on the board for, I encouraged them to start a monthly giving program. This was in 2006. Not a big deal. It's easy to get a merchant account, and we could start doing automatic payments for monthly giving. The nonprofit I'd been working for in Maine had that for 10 years. They've been doing that for 10 years. The local banks in the community where I moved to in Montana, none of them had merchant services accounts. None of them. They didn't even know how to start those. So that's an infrastructure issue that affected the ability of those nonprofits in that area to actually do what was a really common thing, which was monthly giving and direct payments. There can also be infrastructure related to expertise. There might not be the expertise in the area to be able to do what you are recommending. So it can be in programs that you have a very huge challenge recruiting quality workers who have the expertise, but it can also be in fundraising. So if you're talking with somebody who you think would be a great volunteer in a rural area to have, let's say, a text to give strategy in the area, there might not be the expertise with that particular volunteer to even know what you're talking about. So there can be that divide with that infrastructure and that expertise. Finally, you are reaching into cultural issues. One example of a cultural issue that affects fundraising is stewardship. So there are long memories in small towns of whether or not somebody was thanked or not, right? In an urban area, if you don't thank somebody very timely, people won't remember that as much because they're so busy with everything else, right? And it will take a long time for that nonprofit to develop a reputation of that they lack stewardship. They don't think they're donors. It will take a long time for that reputation to develop. In a rural area, that's immediate. If they're not feeling thanked, if they're not feeling like that the nonprofit is grateful for their giving, they will remember it and they will tell all of their friends. In a small town, that means everybody in the town knows immediately that this nonprofit didn't handle it well. And so you have cultural issues related to everybody knowing each other, that means that strategies in our urban area just can't work here. So what are some other strategies that you have heard that have been recommended from somebody in more of an urban area that you don't feel actually could work in our rural area? So what are some of those strategies? Go ahead and unmute yourself or and share the stories more anonymously so we're not outing anybody. But what are some of those recommendations that you've heard and you're like, yeah, it just doesn't work? So go ahead and unmute yourself or put it in chat.
I'll offer one from my perspective, and it's the reason I actually was so fascinated with what Chany does is because I am in a more urban area. And so when I had a very rural client, it was really challenging for me to see whether the strategies were working. You know, some of the things that I would recommend that involved like getting a large group of names and figuring that out, there wasn't that large group of names. And in fact, the area that she was in was fairly low income. And so trying to figure out how to attract dollars in that space was really challenging. And then how to attract dollars from outside of that space into that. And then also identifying who were the wealthier people who were, maybe large farmers, and did she have those relationships? It was really tricky, I think, for me projecting into that area when I didn't have that same base of experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And if that particular executive director would go to the board and say, okay, can everybody give us 10 names? It's the same 10 people. Like everybody's going to give you the same 10 people. It's not going to really expand the database at all because of that. Exactly. Any other ones? Okay. So that actually really flows into the next part of our conversation is what do you need to succeed in rural fundraising? So the first thing is you do have to think about the multifaceted relationships that exist in rural areas. So I was working with a nonprofit who the executive director had moved in from a very large city in California, and she'd moved to this smaller city. It's a 100,000 people, so it's not a rural area. But one of the challenges that she kept running into is that the board, although very ambitious, very successful, the board was unwilling to give names of potential donors to the organization, and she couldn't understand it. They were also very unwilling to have very robust conversations that could lead to controversy. And when I was talking with her, I was explaining that that person, as soon as they leave the boardroom, they're going to see somebody that they've recommended or another fellow board member who they've just disagreed with in the grocery store. They're going to be sitting next to them at the Little League game. They're going to be serving with them on another board. And so these relationships are very multifaceted. And so it becomes very important to those who are in rural areas to protect their relationships. So they have to feel safe in those relationships to be able to either reach out for fundraising or to have more robust conversations that could be controversial. They have to feel very safe. And so you have to keep that in mind, is that it becomes more difficult to say, oh, just give me some names, because in that small area, those people that you'd be reaching out to for those warm introductions or those cold introductions, they will know who gave their name away, right? They will know who's been talking about them because it's a small area. And so it becomes very important to invest in strengthening those relationships, finding out who those key people are, and helping them understand, here's why you can buy into this particular mission or cause. And you spend more time listening so that you're not encouraging anybody to tread on their relationships. There are times where you might tell a board member, I don't want you to fundraise from any of your friends. I don't want you to have to tread on those relationships. But if there is somebody who another board member knows that you don't, would you be willing to come with me for those conversations? So it becomes very important that you give permission for people not to tread on those relationships. The next thing to think about to be successful is making sure you have a clear purpose for events. So in rural areas, events are more than just fundraising. Events are also a social activity. So there are events that are held that do not raise a lot of money in rural areas and seem to be less successful. But it's because the reason why people are coming is because of that social aspect. And so it becomes even more important for nonprofits who are hosting these events to have a clear purpose. Is it going to be a fundraising event where you're going to be capturing the contact information of everyone who attends and cultivating them for the second gift, spending more time talking and listening to them? Or is it going to be a fundraising event, but you're going to spend a huge amount of time showing off the mission? I had a client who had been hosting this event. It was an auction and dinner, or dinner and auction. They'd been hosting the event for 20 years. They contracted with me, and this event was just pretty standard. People came to it. It had been successful in the past because people were coming and people were giving. We shifted the event so that every single aspect of the event really showed off the mission of the organization. And so as it showed off the mission, those attendees who had been coming for 20 years said, oh, I finally get what you're doing. So this organization was a developmental disabilities farm where people with developmental disabilities would live, and then they would help with the farm. So we turned the event from just a dinner and an auction to a barn dance. And then everyone was participating from the home, from this ranch. Everybody was participating and doing skits, showing what they were doing, the way that it was structured, the decoration, everything really pointed to what they did. And so finally, the community that had been supportive actually understood why it mattered that they were giving. They really made that connection. And so it's really important that you define, is this a fundraising event? Is this a fundraising event? Is there that connection to the mission? And will people who leave the event actually understand what you do? So it becomes, in rural areas, oftentimes there will be fun runs, for example, and the whole community comes together and does the fun run. So that's where you have to look at, like, how can we make this more mission driven? So an example of that would be, can we along the fun run have cardboard cutoffs that talk about what we do, that give testimonials, that really start to engage? Can we recruit volunteers who are so excited that these programs actually exist in this community and they want to support it? Can we talk about, for example, going back to the child abuse situation, can we create these gatherings where people will gather together and say, we stand against child abuse, and have it as gatherings, so that there can be those clear purposes that still meet the social needs of the community, that people want to come together and gather. Another thing to think about in terms of succeeding in a rural area is thinking about the non-cash ways that people can give. In rural areas, there is limited income for most areas. It's just part of living in a rural area. So then you have to think about, is there any non-cash ways that will meet our needs? So an example that I'm experiencing right now, I'm renting from a family that lives on a lake. And on the lake right now is a adaptive recreation organization for developmental and physical disabilities. And they bring all of these folks together to spend time in water sports with these adaptive recreations. If the organization were to pay for this beach time, it would be too expensive for the organization to run this particular recreation program. But what they had done years ago is they had really spent time brainstorming who knew whom that had a property on a lake. And they really spent that time developing relationships with anybody who could possibly donate this time on the lake. And it took years to develop, but now it's been going on for years. This is a non-cash type of a donation that really makes the program effective, and it really encourages more of the community to be involved. So that's where it becomes important to look at the budget and say, is there any way that there can be donations of non-cash that will actually be effective for the community? Now, when we have a situation in a urban area and a rural area, the surrounding, and you have, let's say, the businesses in those rural areas who are their profit margins are so small that they cannot give cash to the organization. They struggle to be able to do sponsorships. And so that can be where it's important to look at, is there other ways they can contribute that is not cash? You can also look at, is there ways for you to honor their participation as sponsors, either on an annual basis, that really shows the community that they're involved? So instead of going to them for every single event, is just doing a one annual sponsorship. And oftentimes that would be a larger sponsorship. And there might be times where they are able to give 1 year and not the other, but you still consider them the sponsor for the year that they're not able to give, so that they can give the next year. So that you still keep them as a sponsor, even if they're not able to give 1 year. So we see that with the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic. I am encouraging my rural clients that if you had a long-term sponsor and they can't give this year because of the pandemic and just the after effects, still keep them as a sponsor as a part of that stewardship, so that you can show that you still honor them. Then it's more likely that once they have the ability to give, then they'll come back. So I want to stop here and say, is there anything else that you've noticed that has helped you to succeed in rural fundraising? Is there any other ideas that you have? So go ahead and unmute yourself or put it in chat.
I think, again, I'll jump in at this part and say that, and this is one thing I heard in your Montana video, is values.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you talked about culture, I think there's a perception of self that occurs in all different areas. And I really hear what you're saying about listening. And so one of the things that I found works really well is speaking the language of the people and what's important to them. And I think that can be in any culture, in any group, but I think it's really important when you're, particularly if you could be perceived as an outsider, to really be listening and understanding, oh, this is what's important to this community. And so therefore, I'm going to speak to it about this way. And I think I'll give an example of, like, I had worked at a health organization that taught in high schools, taught health information that involved sex, drugs, things like that. And so that is something that many people might think, oh, that's really great. And some people might also have concerns about. And we had ways, like, for instance, we had a Republican case for the work that we did, and we had a Democrat case for the work that we did. And they were both totally true and totally valid, but we were really speaking into the values of that person and how what we were doing fit that.
Right, exactly. And that goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier about segmenting, right? It is okay in a rural community to segment and to have some of those different talking points, those different messages, those different values, because that is how you're able to show that you're listening, as you're mentioning. So also with that also is an indicator of what your place in the community as well. So an example of this is if somebody says, oh, it's Montucky, it's Montana, Kentucky, I'm like, yeah, you're not from here. Whereas those who are from here are saying Montanan. And so really looking through all of your marketing materials and asking somebody you trust who lives in the area and saying, is there anything that just doesn't speak to you, that really shows that this is sort of an outsider organization, that we're not from here? So asking them to read through it and give you feedback on that becomes really important. So it's finding out what their values are and then speaking towards those values. Exactly. So moving on to our last questions, how can you find resources outside of the area? So one challenge, if you are applying for foundation support outside of a rural area, is the numbers don't work. And what I mean by that is if you have a large foundation that is funding urban areas, the numbers in terms of impact statements that those urban nonprofits are able to talk about are so huge. Whereas in a small area, you can be doing phenomenal work, but because it's a small area, the numbers are small. So a nonprofit working in a 500 town, a population of 500 people, and they are reaching out and they have 100 people involved in that nonprofit, that's huge. But in an urban area, 100 people is nothing, right? That doesn't compute. And so that can be that is a divide that a lot of rural areas have, is they can't attract or they can't attract that foundation support because of that. And so if you're thinking about what are those resources, we have to think about those who grew up and now live elsewhere. So every rural area will have the stories of those folks who grew up in that rural area but have moved. Yet they still consider that rural town their home, and they still want that rural town to succeed. And you can, when you're talking with the community in those rural areas, they will tell you who the folks are that moved and are successful. And so oftentimes you have to look at that rural, you have to look beyond that rural geographic area and think about how can we reach out to them? Is there somebody who's still in contact? To give you an example of this, over the weekend, there was a New York Times story talking about how Nicholas Kristof is thinking about running for governor in Oregon. And a lot of the media reaction was, why? Why would he do that? He has a successful, he's very successful as a columnist for the New York Times. Why would he move back to Oregon and try to become governor of Oregon? But the reality is that he grew up on a rural farm in Oregon, and he's still very connected to that rural farm. And he still wants to help that community where he grew up. So there was a fantastic photo, and it showed him with his arm around his longtime childhood friend, and you would never put the two people together. And oftentimes those folks who've grown up in an area still have those relationships back in that rural area. And so you're looking at how can we reach out to them? How can we encourage them to continue to give? You also have a lot of rural areas running come home campaigns. I showed you one, which is the video that I showed you, is that a lot of rural areas are trying to attract those who grew up in an area back because they can bring those remote jobs. And so starting to look at, is there anyone who's recently moved into the area who have a remote job from an urban area? And then also, as a result of having that remote job, have the urban salaries and spending time talking with them and building a relationship with them to see, are they willing to support? Because they're oftentimes able to give higher amounts. The third area is what I mentioned a little bit earlier. I didn't put it on the slide because it just came up here, is those urban workers who are coming into urban or rural areas. A lot of those urban workers who are working remotely in rural areas, they are connected to larger businesses who have that corporate matching. A lot of rural areas, we don't think about asking if there's any employee matching programs because it just doesn't exist in rural areas. There's not an economy of scale. But for those remote workers, they are oftentimes connected and they do have those matching programs. So one of the other strategies is to start to talk about corporate matching, because that will remind those remote workers that they can actually match to the smaller nonprofits where they're now in the communities where they're living. So thinking about those urban remote workers now have access to a lot more significant resources. They have access to recommend grants. They have access to encourage that. There's also rural volunteer, or there's also matching volunteer programs. So there's a large multinational corporation who is located where I live, and they have these matching volunteer program. So most of the nonprofits in the area, they're always reaching out to that company that in that small branch in this area to actually reach out for those volunteers, because they know that not only is the volunteer time, but then there's also that matching dollars that come with that volunteer time. So those are just some other strategies to look at how can we bring in more resources. Because we don't want to burn out those donors who are currently in the area. Because if they're always being asked, then at a certain point, there is a limit. There is a limit to what they can give. There's a limit that they can't give more. They can't give more frequently. And so that is one of the strategies to make sure that you're not burning out donors. you also, of course, want to spend a lot of time stewarding those donors so that they know that they're well thanked for their gifts. So any other ways that you've reached out for those outside support? Any other ways you've done that? Go ahead and put that in chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself, just so that we can share ideas. Go ahead, Destiny.
Oh, I don't know that everyone has the luxury of this, but
Yeah.
we do have a large board of directors. And so it's a 21-member board of directors. And we do our best to recruit members in our rural areas to have representation of those places as well. And so we lean on them very heavily. If we do have a rural board of director, they help make those connections for us in those communities and introduce us to people and spread awareness about our mission. And that helps immensely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's picking those right people, like you are saying, so that they are trusted in those communities. So that would be an example of, it would be important to expand your board of directors for that one purpose. Yeah. Any other ways that you've attracted outside resources? Okay, so we are almost at time. So I wanted to make sure that we leave some time for any questions. And these could be questions of each other as well, because we bring a lot of knowledge, because some of us live in those rural areas. So any questions?
While people are thinking, I just wanted to make that comment that there are a lot of things that you stated, Chany, that actually just sound to me like good fundraising principles. And one of the things I'm realizing is that maybe what happens in some of the larger, more urban areas is people can be a little bit lazy about it and get away with it longer. Because there's always that next person who doesn't know, and then maybe you got a new development director and you figured out how to do something better and it's okay. Whereas that forgiving portion isn't as prevalent there in the rural area, and that may be one of the biggest differences, because of course you want to be thanking people, of course you want to be doing these things, but I can hear like the urgency around that in a rural area, and the greater listening. I'm like, of course you should be listening to your donors, of course you should be doing this, but yes, I can see that there's like a luxury in that you could burn through a few donors while you're learning in a larger environment. Mm-hmm. So kind of good for all of us to keep in mind.
Yeah. Another example of that is with events. Like, it is best practice to always be showing the mission at an event, but you can get away with it when you're bringing in folks who want just to give someplace and they don't care. And you can have enough people come to those events where it doesn't matter. Whereas in a rural area, they're smaller, the events are smaller. You need to make sure that those events are effective in fundraising. So that's a great example. Yep. Any other questions or ideas? Okay, so there are some resources here that are offered through this webinar series and offered through Elizabeth. Do take advantage of those. And you can go ahead and contact Elizabeth or myself. I am honestly not taking on any more clients because I am full right now, which is a great problem to have in a rural area. But I did want to share this information with you. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. And any last thoughts? Okay. So for everyone who is here, as you're expanding into rural areas, as you are deepening your engagement in rural areas, or as you are living in rural areas, I just wish you the best of luck in building those relationships.
Thank you so much, Chany. This was great.
Thank you.